What happens when an arrogant flight attendant, obsessed with status and power, tries to humiliate a quiet passenger in a worn-out jacket on a private jet, only to discover she's messing with Keanu Reeves himself? You won't believe how this flight ends. Before we continue, let us know where you are watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another special story for you. The private jet rested on the illuminated runway, waiting for its exclusive passengers. The sky, painted in shades of orange and purple from the setting sun, gave the scene an even more cinematic feel. Well-dressed men and women walked across the red carpet leading to the aircraft entrance. Smug smiles, expensive perfumes, and confident strides revealed the elite boarding the flight. Amid this display of luxury, a man in a simple coat and a worn-out backpack climbed the metal stairs without drawing attention. His shoulders were relaxed, his steps contained, and his expression calm, almost detached. With slightly messy dark hair and an unshaven beard, he seemed out of place among these polished figures. Keanu Reeves walked down the spacious aisle, discreetly observing the cabin. Beige leather seats, minimalist chandeliers, and even a small bar on the side composed that refined environment. The other passengers were already seated, engaged in superficial conversations about business investments and their latest extravagant acquisitions. Flight attendant Jacqueline, impeccably dressed, conducted her usual assessment of the passengers. With years of experience on private flights, she had developed a keen instinct for recognizing who was who on board. Her sharp eyes scanned the cabin, evaluating each person based on appearance and posture. When her gaze landed on Keanu, she frowned slightly. Something didn't fit. The worn-out coat, the old backpack slung over his shoulder. He definitely didn't look like someone who belonged there. She watched as he settled into one of the spacious seats, gazing out the window with the serenity of someone used to traveling. But something felt off. Jacqueline approached another flight attendant and whispered, unable to hide her suspicion, "Are you sure they checked the passenger list?" Her colleague looked at her, surprised. "Of course, he's on the list." She cast another critical look at Keanu, biting her lower lip. Maybe he's an assistant to someone important, a personal aide to a tycoon. Keanu, in turn, noticed the flight attendant's suspicious gaze. His dark eyes met hers briefly, and he simply smiled faintly, saying nothing. The engines purred softly as the aircraft door closed and the cabin prepared for takeoff. Jacqueline followed her usual protocol, ensuring all passengers were comfortable. She offered champagne to a pair of business people in the front row, then moved on to another group of excited investors. But when she passed Keanu, she pretended not to see him. He didn't react. He only tilted his head slightly, as if finding the situation amusing. The plane gained speed on the runway, and within seconds, it was airborne, leaving the city behind. Jacqueline stole another discreet glance at Keanu. She still didn't understand what this man was doing there. Little did she know, this silent, seemingly ordinary passenger was about to change her life forever. Jacqueline's eyes narrowed. What is this guy doing here? Little did she know that this simple passenger was about to change her life forever. The plane glided smoothly through the sky as the passengers settled comfortably into their luxurious seats. The in-flight service had begun, and Jacqueline, as always, maintained her impeccable posture. She moved gracefully down the aisle, holding a bottle of expensive champagne, filling the glasses of the most important passengers. The clinking of crystal and hushed laughter blended with the ambient hum of the flight. When she reached the row where Keanu was seated, her gaze passed right over him as if he were invisible. She didn't even bother to offer him a drink. Keanu watched the scene calmly. He didn't seem surprised, let alone offended. He simply folded his hands in his lap and waited. A few minutes later, as Jacqueline passed by again, tending to other passengers, he raised his hand slightly and, in a polite tone, asked, "Excuse me, could I have a glass of water?" Jacqueline stopped for a moment. Her eyes assessed Keanu with a mix of impatience and disdain. Then, in a cold and professional voice, she replied, "Only priority passengers receive full service." The response echoed in the quiet space around them. A few nearby passengers overheard and cast discreet glances, sensing the awkwardness of the situation. The businessman seated 2 seats away from Keanu, however, showed no negative reaction. Instead, he gave a small knowing smile, as if he was used to this sort of thing. He merely tilted his head and murmured, "I see," then turned back to the window as if nothing had happened. The man sitting near Keanu observed the scene closely. Something about that exchange unsettled him. He stared at Keanu for a few seconds, trying to figure out why the man seemed so familiar. He furrowed his brows, adjusting the buttons on his suit as he struggled to pull a memory from the depths of his mind. But before he could say anything, Jacqueline was already moving on, ready to offer her attention and kindness to those she truly deemed worthy of it. The businessman sitting nearby frowned. "This guy looks familiar." But before he could say anything, Jacqueline had already moved on to her next snub. The flight continued smoothly, but inside the cabin, tension was beginning to build. The passengers chatted among themselves, laughed quietly, and enjoyed the luxuries of the in-flight service. However, one detail stood out from the harmony: the way Jacqueline treated Keanu. She didn't just ignore him. She made a point of showing that he didn't belong in that environment. Taking advantage of a moment when she passed by him, Jacqueline decided to take another step in putting him in his proper place. She stopped beside Keanu's seat and, in a professional but slightly condescending tone, said, "Sir, this area is reserved for exclusive clients. There are available seats in the back of the cabin." Keanu lifted his gaze to her. His face was calm, but his eyes seemed to see beyond the surface. "I'm fine here, thank you." His response was firm, but without any trace of confrontation. That irritated Jacqueline. She was used to passengers who simply obeyed her instructions without question. For a moment, she hesitated, but then she decided it wasn't worth insisting and moved away, muttering something inaudible to the other passengers. The businessman who had been watching the scene now followed everything with even greater interest. He noticed Keanu's composed demeanor and the way he handled the disdain without reacting, without retaliating. This made him frown once more. A premeditated accident. A few minutes later, Jacqueline returned, pushing the beverage cart down the aisle. Her expression was impassive, but inside, her patience was wearing thin. As she passed by Keanu, he shifted slightly, unaware that his shoulder would lightly brush against the cart. It was almost an imperceptible contact, but Jacqueline saw an opportunity. With a quick motion, she tilted one of the bottles on the cart, spilling an entire glass of ice water over Keanu. The liquid soaked his coat and part of his shirt. A collective gasp swept through the cabin. "Oh, what a clumsy mistake," Jacqueline said in a falsely apologetic tone, though a small, satisfied smirk lingered at the corner of her lips. All eyes were now on Keanu. He looked down at his wet clothes, took a deep breath, and then lifted his gaze to Jacqueline. He said nothing, just stared at her. But there was something in the way he looked at her, a firm, intense gaze that sent a chill down the flight attendant's spine. The accusation, perhaps, or maybe the discomfort of his stare, or perhaps frustration that someone like him, who refused to feel inferior, was being humiliated. Jacqueline crossed her arms and said, louder than necessary, "You're a fraud. You don't even belong here." The nearby passengers stopped their conversations. The businessman furrowed his brows even deeper. "I've seen this before," Jacqueline continued, her expression full of disdain. "People who don't belong to this lifestyle, trying to fit in. They think they can fool others for a while, but they're always exposed in the end." She tilted her head, analyzing him as if inspecting a defective product. "Are you even American?" Silence filled the cabin. Keanu remained still, his gaze fixed on her. But something in the atmosphere shifted. The businessman watching him raised an eyebrow. He was about to say something when he noticed that Keanu had not yet reacted. And that was when Jacqueline, for the first time, felt a flicker of regret creep up her spine. The way he looked at her, it wasn't anger. It wasn't humiliation. It was as if he already knew exactly what was about to happen next. Keanu looked at his wet clothes, then raised his eyes to Jacqueline. He said nothing, but the way he stared at her sent a chill down her spine. Silence hung in the cabin like a razor's edge, ready to cut. All eyes were on Keanu and Jacqueline. The passengers around them barely dared to breathe, sensing that something was about to unfold. Jacqueline stood with her arms crossed, her lips pressed tightly together. She was expecting a reaction, an explanation, maybe even an apology. But Keanu said nothing. He just watched her. That irritated her more than any response would have. "Are you just going to stare at me? Don't you have anything to say?" Her voice was sharp, almost taunting. Keanu tilted his head slightly, as if analyzing the situation from a different angle. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but carried weight. "It's funny," he said. "You look at me and see a fraud, but I look at you and see someone trying to convince themselves that they truly belong here." Jacqueline's brow furrowed, caught off guard by his words. Keanu continued, "I've met a lot of people like you. People who think that wearing an expensive uniform, walking these aisles with perfect posture, and stepping on others will make them part of something bigger. But do you know what happens when the uniform comes off? When the door closes and the plane lands, you're still just you." A heavy silence filled the cabin. The businessman who'd been watching crossed his arms, intrigued. Some socialites in the front row exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one was more affected than Jacqueline. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Then Keanu added, "The problem isn't me sitting in the seat. The problem is that you're afraid that at the end of the day, there's no seat reserved for you in this game." It was as if he had pulled the ground from under her. Jacqueline felt her face heat up, the anger rising in her throat. It wasn't just because of Keanu's audacity. It was because, deep down, his words had struck exactly where it hurt. "Shut up," she snapped. Without thinking, she raised her hand and slapped him across the face. The sharp sound echoed through the cabin. The muffled laughter from before turned into murmurs of shock. Some passengers' mouths fell open in disbelief. Keanu's face turned slightly with the impact, but he didn't react right away. He ran his tongue over the corner of his mouth, tasting a faint trace of blood from a small cut. Then, slowly, he turned his gaze back to Jacqueline. And this time, there was something different in his eyes. It wasn't anger. It wasn't surprise. It was certainty, as if everything had already been set in motion before it even happened. Jacqueline, who had felt so in control just a second ago, now felt her stomach twist. For the first time, she had no idea how to respond. The socialite in the front row widened her eyes. "Wait, this guy looks like..." But before she could finish her sentence, one of the passengers pulled out a phone and started recording. The sound of the slap still lingered in the air like thunder that refused to fade. The surrounding passengers were in shock. Some held their breath. Others simply stared at the scene, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. Keanu Reeves remained seated, his face slightly turned from the impact. His expression, however, remained unchanged. He didn't raise a hand to his cheek. He didn't react with anger. Instead, he slowly turned his head back and looked directly at Jacqueline. She, on the other hand, seemed more nervous than before. Her breathing was unsteady, and her hands trembled slightly. For the first time, she felt that she had gone too far. Then a different sound broke the silence, a beep. The pilot stepped out of the cockpit, his gaze sharp and filled with urgency. He took in the scene in an instant. His expression darkened when he saw Keanu and the redness on his cheek. Silence was broken by his deep, authoritative voice. "What the hell happened here?" Jacqueline swallowed hard, trying to regain her composure. "A passenger who doesn't know his place," she responded arrogantly. The pilot's face hardened. His nostrils flared. "Do you even know who you're talking about?" he asked, his tone dripping with disbelief. Jacqueline crossed her arms, still trying to assert her authority. "Honestly, I don't care if he's causing trouble on this flight. He should be removed." It was as if the entire cabin held its breath at the same time. The pilot let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. Then he turned directly to Keanu and did something unexpected. He removed his airline cap and gave a slight nod of respect. Jacqueline frowned. Some passengers looked confused. Then the pilot shattered the mystery. "This is Keanu Reeves," he said, "and he owns this airline." The cabin erupted in murmurs. The judgment and doubt that had once filled the air were now replaced by shock and recognition. Jacqueline froze. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Her legs felt weak. Her stomach dropped. Social media was about to explode. Passengers pulled out their phones, some already recording. The businessman who had been watching everything from the beginning crossed his arms and gave a small, satisfied smirk. Well, now, this just got interesting. Keanu, however, remained composed. He simply nodded slightly at the pilot and spoke calmly. Thank you for stepping in, but I think it's already clear to everyone what happened here. Jacqueline knew the humiliation she had so desperately tried to impose on that mysterious passenger had now turned back on her. Her face went pale, her hands were clammy, and her heart pounded erratically. She tried to open her mouth to say something, to justify herself, but there was nothing left to say. The businessman, who had suspected it all along, crossed his arms again. Well, now, this just got interesting. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder. Whispers, shocked glances, and phones being raised to record. The world was about to know what had happened on this flight. Jacqueline felt her heart pounding erratically. Her eyes darted from face to face, searching for some defense, some salvation. But all she found was judgment and disbelief. Keanu remained seated, undisturbed, as if everything was unfolding exactly as it was meant to. The pilot cleared his throat and addressed Jacqueline in a stern tone. Do you have anything to say? She opened her mouth but hesitated. There was no excuse that could erase what she had done. I didn't know, she stammered, but her voice came out weak, almost inaudible. The pilot raised an eyebrow. And if you had known, would you have treated him differently, or just pretended better? The silence was deafening. She wanted to respond, to justify herself, but no argument could change reality. What terrified her wasn't just the present humiliation, but the brutal realization that her mask had fallen. The passenger gazes, once indifferent, were now inquisitive, disapproving. The phones recorded every expression, every bead of nervous sweat on her face. But it was Keanu who made her tremble the most. He still hadn't spoken a single word since the revelation. He didn't judge her, didn't insult her, didn't seek revenge. He simply watched her, and that was worse than any outburst. Then, without hurry, Keanu reached for his phone, unlocked the screen, and calmly typed something. Jacqueline swallowed hard. What are you doing? Her voice now carried panic. Keanu didn't answer. He simply placed his phone back on the armrest and returned to looking out the window, as if everything that had happened no longer mattered. But to her, it did more than anything. Then the pilot spoke again, this time with finality in his tone. We will be making an unscheduled landing. Jacqueline felt the ground disappear beneath her. Her eyes widened, her stomach dropped. What? No, wait, please. Her voice almost broke, desperation leaking through. But no one seemed interested in listening to her anymore. The passengers returned to their seats. The phones continued recording, and Keanu Reeves, owner of the airline, simply watched the sky through the window, as if none of this was even remotely surprising to him. Jacqueline seized this and felt her stomach twist. What is he doing? But before she could react, the pilot spoke again. We will be making an unscheduled landing. The sound of agent footsteps echoed through the cabin. The weight of the situation had finally crashed down on Jacqueline. She was being removed from the flight. Her eyes darted around, searching for someone to intervene on her behalf. But there was no one. No passengers, no colleagues from the crew. Even the pilot avoided her gaze. And Keanu Reeves? He remained seated, calm, gazing out the window as if all of this was nothing more than a minor inconvenience in his journey. The agents took her by the arms, guiding her toward the exit of the plane. Please don't do this. I can explain, Jacqueline pleaded, her voice breaking. But no one seemed interested in hearing her justifications. As they passed by Keanu, she made one last desperate attempt. She turned to him, her voice trembling. Mr. Reeves, I made a mistake. I was stressed. I didn't know who you were. For the first time, Keanu turned away from the window and looked at her. For a moment, The entire cabin held its breath. Then, with a calm, piercing tone, he said, "You didn't need to know who I am. You just needed to know how to treat people." The words struck like a hammer. Jacqueline opened her mouth, but there were no arguments left. Keanu turned back to the window. To him, this chapter was already closed. The agents led her to the exit, and as she stepped down the stairs of the plane, she felt the full weight of reality. Her steps were hesitant. Her mind was in chaos. What would come next? Her job gone. Her reputation destroyed. She looked back at the plane as if there were still some way to undo it all, but the door was already closing. Inside, Keanu Reeves continued his journey as if this had been nothing more than a brief turbulence for him. The flight carried on. For Jacqueline, it had ended forever. The airplane doors closed. For Keanu, the journey continued. For Jacqueline, it had come to an end. The plane had already landed at its final destination. The passengers disembarked calmly, still processing everything that had happened during the flight. Jacqueline's story was already spreading. The video of the slap, the shocked expressions of the passengers, her humiliation as she was escorted off the plane, everything was circulating like wildfire on social media. But Keanu Reeves didn't seem concerned. He walked calmly through the terminal, his worn-out backpack slung over his shoulder, with no security, no entourage, just another traveler in the crowd. But the world was already watching. In the airport concourse, a small group of journalists managed to approach him. "Mr. Reeves, can you comment on the incident during the flight?" a reporter asked, holding a microphone toward him. He paused for a moment, considering the question. The camera flashes flickered, but his face remained calm. People often confuse luxury with money, but true luxury is in how we treat each other, he said. The simple yet powerful response made the journalists exchange glances. Keanu continued, "Money can buy you a seat in first class, but respect, that's something you have to earn." With that, he gave a small, polite smile, thanked them, and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of the airport. The interview went viral. Thousands of people shared the video of Keanu speaking about respect and humility. The hashtag luxury is respect began trending worldwide. Meanwhile, Jacqueline's story took an inevitable turn. Her dismissal was officially announced, with her face plastered across news sites and trending topics. Any attempt at a fresh start seemed impossible. On the other hand, Keanu's message became a symbol of something greater. In a world where power and money often spoke louder, he showed that true greatness lies in how we treat those around us. And while social media continued to debate the incident, Keanu Reeves was already ready for his next flight, living his life without needing to prove anything to anyone. If you enjoyed this story, we have many more that will warm your heart. Click the screen to explore more stories of hope, compassion, and resilience.